The Last Witness. Chapter 1. Shadows over the city. Jonathan Harris, known for his grim paintings, sat in his small studio in downtown Chicago. The night was dark and windy, and shadows from streetlights flickered in his apartment windows. In his hands was a canvas, with the outlines of yet another horrifying scene beginning to take shape. Today, he had witnessed another murder. Walking down the deserted streets of the city, Jonathan heard screams coming from a dark alley. He froze, trying to pinpoint the source of the sounds, and cautiously approached. Through the dim light, he saw a figure in dark clothes brutally attacking a man. Blood gleamed on the cobblestones, reflecting the faint light of a street lamp. Jonathan couldn't look away. He stood there, paralyzed by fear and a strange, incomprehensible fascination. These scenes, so real and terrifying, etched themselves into his memory. He knew he had to capture them on canvas, or the nightmares would haunt him. Returning to his studio, he immediately began to work. A brush soaked in blood-red paint glided over the canvas, creating terrifying details of the scene. His hands trembled, but he continued to paint as if in a trance. The painting came to life under his hands, and each brushstroke took him back to that alley. Meanwhile, his friend and gallery owner, Emily Brown, began to notice changes in Jonathan's behavior. She often visited him in the studio to discuss upcoming exhibitions and new works, but lately, Jonathan had become withdrawn and tense. Emily was worried about him but didn't know how to help. "John, you look terrible," she said one day, entering the studio and seeing his pale face and red eyes. "Maybe you should take a break?" "I can't, Emily," he replied, not looking up from his work. "These images won't leave me alone. I have to paint them, or they'll drive me mad." Emily approached and looked at his new painting. Seeing the violent scene, she shuddered. It was hard for her to understand how Jonathan could create such horrifying works and remain sane. "Do you know the police have started to take an interest in your works?" she asked quietly, trying not to disturb him. Jonathan froze, lifting his head to look at Emily. His eyes were filled with despair. "They think I'm involved in these murders," he said bitterly. "They just want to understand why you are always nearby," Emily explained. "But I know you're innocent. You just happen to be a witness." Jonathan lowered his head and continued to paint. He knew Emily was right, but the sense of guilt and fear wouldn't leave him. He felt something dark and sinister surrounding him, and each new day became harder to endure. Chapter 2. The Gallery of Darkness. With great difficulty, Emily Brown organized an exhibition of Jonathan's works in a prestigious gallery. She hoped it would help him cope with his inner demons and return to normal life. The opening night was filled with people admiring the grim and disturbing paintings. Mark Thompson, a young and ambitious artist, came to the exhibition to see Jonathan's works he had heard so much about. Passing by a row of paintings, he stopped at one depicting a brutal murder scene. Mark felt a chill run down his spine. It was hard to look away from the painting, and he felt a strange attraction to this dark art. "Impressive, isn't it?" said Emily, noticing his interest. "Jonathan really knows how to capture the darkest corners of the human soul." "It's incredible," Mark replied, not taking his eyes off the painting. "I've never seen anything like it. Where does he get his inspiration?" Emily sighed and looked at Mark sadly. "He too often witnesses such scenes in real life," she explained. "It's his curse and his gift." Mark pondered her words. He couldn't imagine what it was like to constantly see death and suffering and still find the strength to capture it on canvas. He felt both admiration and anxiety at the same time. Meanwhile, Jonathan, standing in a distant corner of the gallery, watched the proceedings. He felt like a stranger among these people who came to admire his horrifying creations. It seemed to him that they only saw the surface, not understanding the depth of pain and horror he put into each painting. Emily approached him, noticing his gloomy mood. "Are you okay, John?" she asked, placing a hand on his shoulder. "I'm not sure," he replied quietly. "Sometimes it feels like I'm just trapped in these paintings. That I'm becoming part of this horror myself." Emily squeezed his hand, trying to convey some warmth and support. "You're not alone, Jonathan. We're all here to help you. Just remember that." Jonathan nodded, but the worry remained in his eyes. He knew his journey was only beginning, and more darkness awaited him. Chapter 3. Nightmares. At night, Jonathan couldn't sleep. It seemed to him that the walls of his apartment were closing in on him, suffocating him. The ghosts of the people he had depicted on his paintings haunted him. He saw them in every corner, in every reflection. These visions were so real that he couldn't distinguish them from reality. He got out of bed, feeling his heart racing. Taking a brush in his hands, he approached yet another blank canvas. His hand moved on its own, drawing the contours of another murder scene. Blood-red strokes filled the canvas, and Jonathan once again found himself in the very alley where he had witnessed the crime the night before. "I can't take it anymore," he whispered to himself, closing his eyes. "I can't bear it any longer." But despite the fear and despair, he couldn't stop. Each new brushstroke brought him brief relief, as if releasing the darkness that had accumulated inside. He worked until morning, until the first rays of the sun began to penetrate his studio. When the painting was finished, Jonathan felt his legs give way. He fell to his knees before the canvas, feeling tears streaming down his cheeks. It seemed to him that he was losing his mind. Emily, entering the studio in the morning, found him in this state. She quickly approached him and hugged him. "John, what happened?" she asked in panic, stroking his head. They won't let me go," he sobbed. "I see them everywhere. I can't take it anymore." Emily understood that his condition was getting worse. She decided he needed professional help but knew it would be difficult to convince him to see a psychologist. "You need to rest, John," she said gently. "I'll find someone who can help you. Please, trust me." Jonathan nodded, although he wasn't sure anyone could help him. He felt he had gone too far in his madness. Chapter 4. The Investigation. Detective Michael Reeves couldn't ignore the strange coincidence. Every time a murder occurred, Jonathan Harris was nearby. He began to study Jonathan's paintings more carefully, and what he saw shocked him. The paintings were so detailed and accurate that it seemed the artist was at the crime scene. Reeves came to the gallery and met with Emily to ask her some questions. "Emily, you've known Jonathan for a long time. Have you noticed anything strange about his behavior?" he asked. Emily tensed up but decided to be honest. "Yes, he's changed a lot lately. He's become more withdrawn and tense. But I'm sure he's not involved in these murders. He's just a witness." "Why are you so sure?" Reeves asked, looking at her intently. "I've known Jonathan for many years. He's not capable of this. He's just a very sensitive person, and his works are his way of coping with what he sees." Reeves pondered her words. He wanted to believe Emily, but his intuition told him something was wrong. He decided to continue watching Jonathan, hoping to find answers. Meanwhile, Jonathan was becoming increasingly paranoid. He felt he was being watched, which heightened his fears. He began avoiding people, going out only at night to avoid encounters. One night, when he went out again to find inspiration for a new painting, he noticed he was being followed. His heart beat faster, and he quickened his pace. It seemed to him that the shadows on the walls were coming to life and following him. Reeves, watching Jonathan from a distance, understood that the artist was on the brink. He knew he had to act quickly to prevent a possible catastrophe. Chapter 5. On the Brink of Madness. Jonathan was on the brink. He could no longer distinguish reality from his nightmares. Everywhere he looked, he saw murder scenes. His mind was filled with screams and images of suffering. He spent several days locked in his studio, completely absorbed in his paintings. His body weakened from lack of sleep and food, but he couldn't stop. He knew that if he stopped painting, his mind would finally give in. Emily, realizing that time was running out, brought a psychologist to help Jonathan. But he refused help, believing that no one could understand his suffering. "I have to deal with this myself," he said, rejecting the offered help. "This is my cross to bear." Emily was desperate. She knew that without help, Jonathan might not survive. She decided to turn to Detective Reeves, hoping he could find a way to help. Meanwhile, Jonathan, in a state of complete despair, began painting his final piece. On the canvas appeared his own figure, committing suicide. He knew this was the only way to escape the suffering. When the painting was finished, Jonathan felt a strange sense of relief. He took a knife in his hand and, without hesitation, plunged it into his heart. His life ended on the same note as his paintings, in blood and pain. Chapter 6. The Last Painting. Mark Thompson, a young artist, accidentally witnessed Jonathan's suicide. He entered the studio just as Jonathan took his final step. Mark was shocked and stunned, not knowing what to do. After the initial shock, he felt an overwhelming desire to capture this moment on canvas. He knew this could be his most significant work, but didn't realize the consequences. Mark began to paint, completely immersed in the process. He felt a strange satisfaction with each brushstroke. But as the painting came to life, he began to notice the same signs of madness that haunted Jonathan. Visions and nightmares started to torment him. Emily, seeing Mark's painting, realized the story was repeating itself. She tried to convince him to stop painting, but Mark was too absorbed in the process. His mind was already cracking under the pressure of visions and nightmares. Mark's painting, depicting Jonathan's suicide, became the new center of attention in the gallery. People came to see it, but no one knew about the dark forces it awakened. Emily felt this painting brought new waves of horror, but couldn't stop the cycle. Jonathan's story ended, but the darkness surrounding him continued to live in his works and be passed on to new victims. Mark became the next victim, and his fate was sealed. The end. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to our channel and don't forget to hit the like button. Thank you for your attention.